Hello and welcome to Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today, brief update, and then I want to talk about the willing suspension of disbelief. So the update is, I apologize. I life happens. Uh, there are certain things that you have to prioritize in your day. There are certain things you have to prioritize in your life, and I'm afraid that a lot of the YouTube stuff has taken a back burner. Despite that, I've been trying to record videos. I've been trying to upload things. I just haven't been able to give it the same time and attention I had in the past, and I am very sorry about that. But like I said, life happens. I have to prioritize certain things in my life, and unfortunately, that means I am not giving the YouTube stuff really the attention that you deserve. So I am very sorry about that, particularly when I'm not responding to comments or when I'm trying to respond to comments, but my mind is not on it. I'm actually focused on other things. It's not fair to you, and I apologize. But all that being said, it may mean that in the future, there may be a slight slowdown in the number of videos that I post. Again, I'm sorry, I will do my best. I hope to always put up a video that is interesting. Um, Whether or not they are, I never. They're generally things that I find interesting to talk about. But like I said, there may be a slight slowdown. I will do my best, but there are other things going on in my life that I have to prioritize, and I am sorry. But the purpose of this video was to talk about the willing suspension of disbelief and how it is not actually quite as cut and dried as sometimes we make it out to be. The first part is sometimes we just call it the suspension of disbelief. And we forget that the willing part is actually quite important. So let's deal with that first. If you go into a narrative, be it a film, a television show, or a book, and you are unwilling to suspend your disbelief, you can tear that narrative to pieces. It is usually very easy to do. You just start picking at threads and you tear it apart. And we are all guilty of this. We have all encountered a narrative that was either not intended for us, that we were the wrong audience, or that we were in the wrong frame of mind of when we experienced it. And because of that, we thought it was awful, it was terrible, and we just listed a whole load of things. And the people around us were going, "You're just being mean about it." That happens because we have to be willing. It is a contract or a compact between the writer, the author, and the reader, the viewer, that we have to meet them halfway and they have to meet us halfway. They have to do their best to spin a tale, to tell a story, to give us a narrative that we can believe in. They have to do their best to do that. But we also have to be willing to let them do it. And that means sometimes turning off the knee-jerk reactions that we have. So that's an important distinction. And what I'll say about this is sometimes authors fail and sometimes we fail. It just happens. People are human. Um, it happens. It's not a bad thing. It's just something that happens and we have to deal with and we just simply have to be cognizant of. But the second thing in is, what do we mean by the suspension of disbelief? It's not turning off the critical part of your brain. That's not what it is. But it is being aware that at some level, what we are experiencing is a story. And that story is not necessarily focused on, concerned with, or functioning by the rules with which we understand our universe. So by this, I mean, let's take a couple of very clear cut examples, extreme examples that make this hopefully crystal clear. Animal Farm by George Orwell. If I said, well, this is ridiculous, all of these animals are talking. Well, most of the animals are talking, and that's stupid. These animals can't talk. Animals can't talk. This is just dumb. You'd be quite right in saying, AP, that is a ridiculous thing to say. That is just dumb. It's an animal fable. The rules of the narrative are that certain animals in this narrative can talk. You're ignoring the rules of the story the construct that has been created. You're just ignoring that because animals in our world don't talk like that. And then I make the complaint, oh, well, at one point, the pigs stand up, walk around on two legs, and wear human clothes. That's ridiculous. Pig physiology doesn't match human physiology. They can't walk that way. They can't wear clothes that way. And where are their opposable thumbs? How are they meant to open doors? This is just dumb. And again, you would be very right in saying, AP, you're being ridiculous. That is a dumb thing to say. It is not a proper or valid criticism of the text because this is an animal fable. It's not meant to be realistic in that way. Now, does that mean that George Orwell's Animal Farm is not an important text? No. Does it mean it's not a smart text? No. Does it mean that we can just ignore any and all aspects of it? No, of course not. But how we approach it, we have to approach it understanding that it is being told in the form of an animal fable, which is not realistic. But we still have the interactions between the various characters, the various animals who are representative of a class of person from an historical time period or particular people within that historical time period that Orwell was using for his allegory. Like, we have to be aware of that. We can look to moments when Orwell streamlines things or when he simplifies the complexity of that period of Russian history to put it into the animal narrative. We can look at those things. We can analyze those things. We can be critical of the choices that he made. We can understand those things. That's all fine. We can be critical, but we have to be aware that not all forms of criticism are going to be appropriate or valid. Criticizing it on the grounds that animals can't talk is just dumb. We can dismiss those arguments out of hand because they are not dealing with the narrative in front of them. They're dealing with some other narrative that they wanted, but wasn't one that Orwell wrote. So, in something like that, we can see we ignore the fact that animals can't talk and walk around like humans, and that other humans would treat animals as if they were humans and not go, this is all really weird. That they're not acting in psychologically real ways to talking animals, because that's not the form of narrative that it is. We deal with it in the form of fable and political allegory. We look at it in those terms, and we deal with it in the terms of the narrative as Orwell set them out. So we can see applying a realist lens, applying realist critique in that way is inappropriate, invalid, and ludicrous, and we can dismiss it out of hand. It's not useful. It's not interesting. Now, that doesn't mean that someone who feels that way about the text is lying or shouldn't have those feelings. You can feel however you want to about a text. That's about the reader experience. That's about you wanted a narrative that did those things in that way. And that's fine. It's fine to want those things. But to criticize Orwell for not doing the things that you wanted is not dealing with Orwell's text. It's dealing with your own desires, your own preferences. And that is a different conversation. It is framed a different way and is discussed a different way. So that's one thing. So that lays out, you can see how suspension of disbelief operates according to sort of genre, if you will, the style, the type of story. Another example of this would be something like mythic storytelling. If we think of Tolkien's Legendarium, Elrond's dad straps a Silmaril to his forehead, a jewel to his forehead, gets in his boat, sails into space, and becomes a star. Do we start asking questions about, well, how does he breathe in space? No, that is a dumb question to ask. That is a ridiculous question to ask. Do we? Well, how did he sail into space in a sailing boat that was designed to sail around on the sea? You go, no, it's kind of magic. What does he eat when he's out there? Is he still alive? Is he immortal? He's in a vacuum. He's in space. What does he eat and drink? And where does he go to the toilet? You don't ask those questions because it is mythic. It's a myth. It's not history. it is myth. It is operating with a different set of criteria, a different set of rules, a different set of expectations, and applying the expectations of a realist narrative or a narrative that is framed in sort of mundane reality of some kind is entirely inappropriate to the discussion of, well, how does the half elven sailor survive in space as a star? You can see why, again, taking that approach to it, you'd go, you're an idiot if those are the questions that you're saying. Tolkien made a mistake. This is an error in his narrative because, well, clearly you need to consider these things. In much the same way, when we look at myths about Thor, where Thor strikes a giant in the head with his hammer 3 times, and the giant suffers no damage because the giant is a sorcerer, and magically 3 new mountain valleys appear. We don't ask questions about how. We don't try to understand it in terms of realist logic because it is entirely inappropriate to the type of narrative. It is a mythic narrative. It is not a fantasy story set in a secondary world that we are meant to treat as real. Because this is where fantasy gets into really bizarre territory because there are all of these different levels of fantasy, all of these different levels about suspension of disbelief. And we see it in science fiction as well, actually. A good example of that, TIE fighters, the sound that TIE fighter engines make in Star Wars, that very distinctive TIE fighter scream. And it is distinctive, it is iconic. You immediately recognize it, and you go, yeah, well, they made a mistake because there's no sound in space. That's dumb. That's a mistake. You, but it sounds really cool. And it's not that the rule of cool excuses it. It's a suspension of disbelief. We start Star Wars with a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. It is a fairy tale. It is a fairy tale dressed up as science fiction, but it is not meant to be taken as real. And yet, when you watch Andor, Andor has done away with the mythic, the fairy tale, the sort of the fabulosity, the extreme fantasy of Star Wars, and is looking at it almost as a realist story within a very believable science fictional universe about the everyday people and the mundanity of evil and scheming, uh, bureaucratic evil and fascistic governments and the double dealing and scheming of politicians and spies. It's a very grounded story. It is operating at a very different level to a lot of the other Star Wars stories. And yet it still has the sound of TIE fighters in space because that's the rule of the diegetic universe. That's the rule of the story world. But it's operating as a different style of narrative. And therefore, if Andor started doing some of the things that happened in Return of the Jedi, it would suddenly become less believable because Andor isn't that type of story. Even though it's in the same universe, it's in the same story world. The actual genre has shifted slightly. It's still part of science fiction, but it's a different part of science fiction and it has different rules. It's operating with a much more banal, mundane realism running through it than the grand, epic, fairy tale, mythic qualities that we saw in Star Wars. So even within that universe, you can have different types of stories. We see this within the Legendarium as well. In The Hobbit, a story intended for children, The Hobbit feels and reads very differently to The Lord of the Rings, which is intended to be read by adults. That it's not that bad things don't happen in The Hobbit, but there is a silliness to The Hobbit. There is a fun to The Hobbit. It is there to entertain children, but still with the quality that Tolkien brought to it. But those things are very different in The Lord of the Rings. Look at the difference between the goblins and the Goblin Kingdom in The Hobbit and the orcs and the goblins in Moria in The Lord of the Rings. Look at the difference between the trolls in The Hobbit and the trolls in the Lord of the Rings. They're exactly the same creatures. They're in the same world, but they are treated very differently because the narratives themselves are different types of narratives because they're intended for different audiences. And it doesn't mean that The Hobbit is less good. It doesn't mean that Tolkien made a mistake in The Hobbit. But the style of story, the suspension of disbelief we are to have about it is conditional upon the audience type. And so we don't go, the orcs of Tolkien's universe are X, and that is consistent all the way through. You go, the early legendarium is very mythic. Then you have The Hobbit, which is a children's story. And then you have The Lord of the Rings, which is an adult story, but much more like a secondary world fantasy. And each of those are operating with different narrative paradigms. And there is a consistency to elements of the world, but how they are relayed, how they are treated, the essential qualities of them are actually different in each of the different types. And this is why suspension of disbelief is not a blanket excuse for authors to do anything or writers to do anything. There is part of their compact in it, but part of that compact is on us. We have to be aware of the fact that what we are engaging with, are we engaging with it with the right attitude toward the suspension of disbelief? Have we accurately guessed or assigned the type of narrative? When we watch a romantic comedy film, which is set in our world according to our laws of reality, but it's a romantic comedy, there are things that are going to happen in that film that you go, that's just not realistic. You go, yes. But did it work in the film? Yeah, oh, yeah, it was a great scene in the film. Because even though it is set in our world, even though it is meant to be mimetic, even though it is meant to evoke our reality, we are still aware of its artificiality as a romantic comedy. We are still willing to suspend our disbelief in some of these regards because we want to be entertained with that type of story. One of the problems that science fiction and fantasy run into is because it's not set in our world, we are already trying to engage with it as a secondary world. And because of that, think of it as a gauge of your suspension of disbelief. You've already used part of it up to believe in the world that it is set in. And because of that, we tend to make the world concrete. We tend to establish it as a secondary world that exists. And if something doesn't immediately then conform to that, if the author takes a shortcut, if the author doesn't focus on something the way that we think that they should within that reality, then it can break our suspension of disbelief. We don't have enough to sort of go with it. But we still have to be aware that there's a difference between the folkloric and the mythic, these fairy tale, all these different aspects, and secondary worlds that are meant to be read as real, and secondary worlds that are meant to be evocative, that are meant to be read as stories. That not all of them are to be read as the same register, with the same levels applied. When we read the Iliad, we don't ask questions about, well, they were there for 10 years. Where were all of their supplies coming from in the siege? They only have little boats. They sailed up, they beached the boats, they laid siege to the city. Where did they get all their supplies from for 10 years? You don't ask those questions. And they're not really appropriate questions to ask because the Iliad is not history. It is a myth about the siege of Troy. It is a grand story. It is not focused on, nor concerned with, nor even thinking of those mundane aspects because it is not a mundane story. That's not the focus. That's not the style. That's not what it's about. At the same time, we watch something like Star Trek, and how many times have we asked the question, where did they go to the bathroom? How come that the big things only ever happen when the captain's on the bridge or in his ready room? That, surely they must have multiple shifts. And what do they do in the off time? Like, what's going on? The life on the starship is so artificial because it doesn't reflect how an actual ship would function because it's a TV show. It's not concerned with those things. That's not the point. And yet we find sometimes when they add in those little moments, that adds to the sense of verisimilitude, that adds to the sense of giving us something to hang our suspension of disbelief on. It helps us. And so it's always a balance between these little mimetic elements or verisimilitudinous elements to create an authentic story world. But that authenticity is not always based in realism. And that's why suspension of disbelief is so important. And that's why we have to be willing to extend that suspension of disbelief. But thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support. And I will see you in the next one.